Hey, you know who it is. This is Cruz of Olympian Multimedia, and we are offering you another segment of A Word with the World. And as you can see, we are in our virtual studio today, and we got a special guest. Just to give you a quick backstory to my guest today, he is another incredible author that I met recently at a Woodbridge book event. Shout out to Jay Logan in the city of Woodbridge for their hospitality and setting up the event. Met all kinds of interesting people. And one of our guests today is one of them individuals that I had a chance to talk with. And he definitely gained another fan to the multitude of fans that he already has when it comes to his books. He is the proud author of the Drowned Realm series, and hopefully you can see on the screen. We have the first book here, Rise of the Red Harbinger, and then part two. Hopefully I'm pronouncing this correctly. The Ghost of Asher.
Yep, Ghost of Asher.
There we go. Hope you guys see it on the screen. So I want you guys out there to uh, show some love because we're gonna have a great discussion discussing getting more in depth into his writing process and his books that are simply incredible. So give it up for Mr. Khalid Uddin. What's going on today, yeah, Khalid?
Not much. Just looking forward to talking about writing and the whole process. Just excited to just talk shop with you.
I'm excited. Um, I think we spoke about it before. Again, I'm a big fan of your work. I couldn't put these books down. I read both of your books within like a 4 to 5 day time frame. Um, just really enthralled. Just the world building aspects, the character development. We're going to get into it a little bit more, but uh, the books remind me, just to give you a little bit of insight for you guys out there. It it reminds me a lot of the Lord of the Rings series, specifically the Silmarillion, and it reminds me of the Inheritance Cycle book series with Christopher Paolini. If you guys are familiar with that, it's the main character is Aragon. Please don't base base it on the movie because the movie's horrible. So if you are interested in reading that book series, I definitely recommend it. Do not base your decision on the movie. Please don't. Uh, but these two books kind of remind me of that. It's just so in depth, the world, so many different types of subplots. The characters, there's certain characters, it's kind of like you had that kind of feel like, ah, man, I wish I could go through this book and strangle them a little bit. You know what I mean? Then there's other characters, it's like you really feel emotionally attached to, I guess you could say. So without further ado, let's not hold back because I don't want to give up everything here, man. Let Khaled speak for himself when it comes to his body of work, which is so impressive. So let's get right into it. Khaled, when it comes to writing stories, it's always an intriguing method of expressing yourself, right?
Sure.
In a creative manner. So when it comes to developing your stories, do you gravitate more from personal experiences or from your in-depth version of imagination?
Honestly, it was a combination of both, especially starting off. I want to say when I was new to writing and for like originally developing the story and like realized I had an idea, a lot of it came from like inspiration in real life, like basing characters off of real people. Like for instance, in book one, a lot of like especially the main characters and like that core group of like guys that like end up coming together. That's all based on like my circle of friends, like when I was in college, and based the personalities
Awesome.
off of them, some of the adventures and everything. Um, and it was a good starting point. And then I think once like I had that in place, that's when a lot of the imagination started to just like pour through and give me all the bigger ideas for the story. So yeah,
Awesome.
I think as you get more confident as a writer, the imagination, is more what puts you through rather than just real life experiences and things that you've been through. Like I think that always like shows through anyway, but I feel like um you don't have to rely on that as much, like once you become more confident and comfortable as a writer.
That's a really good point. So I hope you viewers out there kind of took that in. I'm a big advocate from that when it comes to reading. I feel like that's the best way of kind of like showcasing your identity
Yeah,
as an author, as a writer through your book. If you kind of base things on personal experiences,
right.
you don't have to really be in depth as far as like actually using people's names that you know, or actual, go in depth on certain
Right.
situations,
For better or
like
worse.
putting your privacy out there.
Yeah,
Yeah, but also too, it's just a great starting point, I guess,
yeah,
because a lot
absolutely.
of times, the different experiences that we go through, a lot of people can resonate with that.
And
And
I think
then,
that was good. Sorry.
no, no, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I think as a writer, as an artist in any medium, there are parts of you that you want to share with the world, that you want to share with audiences, and even if
Mhm.
like it doesn't show up exactly the same way as it happened to you in real life,
Hmm.
there are still ways of making those ideas, those ideologies, those like experiences show through. And I think again, that's kind of why a lot of my early on ideas were based on real life, just because there were certain things that I needed to get out, to share with like readers or an audience, or however big or small it was.
Hmm. But also too, I like the point that you brought up about like the imagination. Like as you get better as a writer and you
Yeah,
start bettering at your craft, then you can use elements of imagination to
right.
kind of broaden the story a little bit. But using your personal experiences is always like a great building block
Yeah,
to creating that foundation for your writing. So that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up.
yeah.
So this one, this next question I'm gonna ask you something a lot of people ask me personally. So I'm intrigued to know what your answer is going to be to this.
Okay.
So, Tyler, what do you find more challenging? Developing the concept for the story, the world building, character development, writing the story itself, or the actual editing process?
Oh man, that's all challenging, but I think um, I think the world building aspect is a challenge, but for specific reasons. It's not so much that it's not enjoyable. I think it's more the mindset that, like, since you're not actually writing, you're not being productive, and that took a long time for me to grasp. Like, even now, it's not always about like the word count. If you're world building, if you're like developing countries, cultures, religions, mythology in your own story, that's just as important as getting the words out, if not more important, because I mean, especially in the fantasy genre, without proper world building and thinking about all those little things, then your stories just is just not going to jive. And I've definitely seen that, in certain series or certain books. And I'm not going to put anybody down, but like you can kind of pick up on that, when something doesn't make sense. And I always tell, um, my students, who are, beginner writers, like if there's something in your story that pulls the audience out of it, that makes them stop and think, then you're doing something wrong, because, the whole idea is to get lost in the story, and you don't want to have to stop and think like, could this really happen? Or wait a second, like he said something different on page two, because again, that pulls you out and you don't have the ability to get lost. So honestly, I think that's why the world building is one, the most difficult part, but also the most important, just because the amount of time it takes to make sure you do it properly.
I love it. Uh, that's usually my answer. So I'm glad to see that we're in tune with each other
Yeah,
on that. I totally agree with that. Writing this, some people feel like people that I talk to, they feel like actually writing the story itself will probably be the hardest part.
yeah,
To me, it's not because already in your head, you already kind of visualize what the story is
right,
going to be
right,
anyway. The hardest part is like obviously you're going to have different backdrops, different locations. You got to
right.
describe them things in your story. And then the
Yeah,
character themselves. You don't want every character to be bland,
yeah,
nor do you want the characters to be the same.
right.
You want every character to have their own feeling. So
Absolutely.
it's kind of like you got to think in your head, like, how can I really describe this person? You know what I mean? In a way where people can resonate with, but it don't sound boring either.
Yep.
Because sometimes you get in that kind of realm too, right?
Yeah,
Whereas like it seems like you're all in this one character or maybe these couple characters, and
Right.
then your other characters are kind of lacking in personality,
Absolutely.
and then they end up being bland. And then as a reader, you're kind of like, I don't know if I'm going to continue to be invested in this story because like mostly everybody in here, or at least like half of the characters in here, they just seem very dull in comparison to others, right?
That definitely happened to me early on. Like, when I was just like in the first couple of chapters of the first book and, it was a first draft and everything, I, gave it out to like my friends who were also fantasy fans just to see what they thought. And that was, I think, the biggest critique early on is like you have three or four characters here that kind of seem very similar. Like they definitely need different personalities. And again, you learn about that. You change the way they speak or the way they react to things. And again, it kind of goes back to that world building where you have to think of like your characters um details like to so many degrees just to make sure that even the way they get mad or the way they think about something is different than somebody else because that's just how it goes in real life.
Yeah. And I hope you guys out there, viewers, picked up on that little tip that Khaled just said about willing to let other people read your work
Yeah.
before you get toward that final process or the final stages of your process. Um, I know some people are a little apprehensive about that because it's like, I don't know, maybe they're scared of rejection. Maybe
Right.
it's like, oh, really don't want nobody to read my stuff early on. But it's actually a very helpful tool and resource to yourself, especially if you give it to people who you really trust
Yeah.
enough that's going to give you the feedback that you need. It could
Right.
definitely be instrumental for you guys out there who are aspiring to be a writer to kind of like build on your craft and give you that confidence, because of course a lot of times you're looking at it like, man, this sounds pretty good to me. I don't really see no mistakes. And then when you give it to someone else, they seeing it from a
Yep.
different perspective,
Yeah.
And sometimes you need that so that it can kind of strengthen your resolve as a writer.
Absolutely.
So let's get right into the meat and potatoes here, as it were, Khaled. And let's talk
Sure.
about these great books of yours. In your books, The Red Harbinger and The Ghosts of Asher, you dive into, as already mentioned, the realm of fantasy, very deep rooted with elements of storytelling and the world building, and you do it in such a masterfully creative way, as I
Thank
might add. So, what inspires you to write in this style?
you. So I'm a very visual person, and I think when this story started coming together for me, like way back, in the beginning of, the like the beginning of its conception, it was a lot of visuals, and I think I just wanted to write it that way, just because I wanted it to come across the way I was picturing it, and so like it was definitely purposeful to describe things vividly and it kind of goes the same way. I again, as an early writer, I don't know how well I pull that off, but again, with advice and critiques and feedback and everything like that, I definitely try to do a better job of making that happen. But the same thing goes, and I think that's also why, as a writer, it's an important thing to be a reader, just to see how other people do it and whether they pull it off. And I definitely remember getting frustrated by certain books, like because I couldn't visualize what they're talking about. But then other books, like for instance, Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series, it's
Hmm.
people complain that it's a 14-book series, but the world that he builds is just so masterfully done. That was honestly my biggest inspiration for wanting to become a fantasy writer in the first place. And just seeing like everything that he described and being able to picture it all, that was one of the biggest models for me, just wanting to have other people be able to visualize. And it was also a fine line. I mean, I think sometimes you have to make sure you're not putting too much emphasis on the wrong things, like describing in full what a side character is wearing who's never going to show up again, as opposed to what the main character is doing and how they look, and just like those little details. Um, so I think that was like the biggest focus, is just making sure that the right detail was going into the important parts. If that makes
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. But I also like the point, too. Again, hope you guys are paying attention because he just dropped another good point about the importance of reading. Like to me, if you're not, this is my personal opinion. If you don't really have good reading habits, I wouldn't really recommend you to become a writer.
Right.
Because reading definitely it goes beyond just giving you the motivation to write, but just reading in itself, the terminology being used, the wording. Again, we're just talking about these elements of character development and world building, just seeing how other authors put together these different things.
Right.
And if you can't see yourself as you read and visualize it in your head, because I know when I was reading your books, it was almost like a movie being played in my head, where it's like I actually was like picking actors to play
That's
these
awesome.
different roles in my head as I'm
Yeah.
reading it. If you're not that type of visual type person or really in depth when it comes to your reading, me
Yeah.
personally, I wouldn't recommend anybody to write because I think you really need that
Yeah.
in order to be an effective writer.
Yeah. It definitely there were definitely points where like it was intentional, like I knew I was going out of my way to make those descriptions. I remember like I think it might have been in the first few chapters of the first book, like one of the characters is, I think he like flips himself around on a horse and jumps off the back just to, like go at something. And I just remember like thinking in my head exactly how this needed to be described to, make people be able to visualize it. Just because, like in my own head, I thought it was such a cool scene to write out. And I just kept thinking like, I hope this comes across the way I'm trying to describe it, because it would make for such a cool visual.
Mm-hmm. Like me too. Like I've been getting into early on and been more like a poet. Most of the stuff
Yeah.
I put out is poetry,
Okay.
but in my last couple books, I kind of dive into the whole short stories.
Nice.
And one thing people notice with in my short stories is that I don't really have any dialogue
Okay.
at all. It's very minimal, and that's on purpose because I tend to rely more on the emotions expressed by the central characters
Okay.
to kind of create the dialogue, if that makes
Sure.
any sense.
Yeah.
And then the way they interact with the world around them, people can start getting, the reader could get an understanding of what's really
Right.
going on.
Right.
So I'm really with that, what you were saying about just describing things perfectly,
Yeah.
but not too much to the point where it's like now you're getting overly specific. Now you're talking about the color of his shoelaces on, you know what I mean? Like you're
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
getting real crazy with it, and it's not really needed in your writing.
Right.
Like people can get the gist of it. Certain things can be open for interpretation to a
Absolutely.
certain extent.
Yeah,
You
and
know what
that's
I
what
mean?
I meant, by taking people out of the story too. Like, once you get to that point where you're, like you said, explaining like the color of people's shoelaces and maybe they got
Yeah.
phrases, it has nothing to do with it. Then you're sitting there wondering, like, is this going to be important later on? Are they going back to places?
No, that's a good point because there's certain readers or certain books I read, and it's like, man, they're really emphasizing this one point, and I'm like, I'm wondering if this is really integral to the
Yeah,
rest of the
it's probably
story.
important.
And then as you're reading it, it's like that has nothing to do with what's going on here. So I don't know why we spent 1.5 pages on this one thing.
Yeah,
But I get it. It is what it is. It's a work in progress for
yeah,
everyone. But
absolutely.
I'm glad you brought that point up. So in the Red Harbinger, or the Rise of the Red Harbinger, you incorporated different scenarios. So I'm just going to give for you viewers out there just a quick little overview without not really giving nothing away. But the scenarios you brought up are such as betrayal, as one of the harbingers turned against his own brethren for his own personal gain, and then in turn was banished for his insolence. And then you also spoke of the responsibilities from the descendants of Dorian and how they were tasked with saving the land of Asher while trying to find and embrace their own identity as they come into these newfound powers that they
Right.
acquire. And it was also interesting to know as they're trying to learn to control these powers, how the inhabitants of this world over time end up turning their backs on them. So, how important was it for you to implement this vast range of emotions and layers of characterization in your story?
Um, To be honest, that was the central focus. And I'm definitely of the mindset that if you have rich characters, not that like you can have a bad story, but that's what drives a story, And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, even as a writer, and sometimes we go through like our struggles and writer's block and all that kind of stuff. But having like rich, complete, like layered characters, a lot of times that ends up writing the story for you. Just because, like, you know, I've definitely talked about outlining and planning ahead and plotting and everything with like other writers and prospective writers, and a lot of times the question is, how much do you outline? Do you have everything out like to a specific T? And my mindset is I outline generally, and then when it gets to it, I have a starting point and I kind of know where
Mm-hmm.
I want to end up. But a lot of times the characters dictate where that's going to go in between, just because I let, once you create them, and again, it goes into the world building, once you create them and, have them in depth with all that personality and emotion and everything, a lot of times they write the story for you. And, I think that's the fun of it too, because sometimes that surprises you as a writer. I was telling somebody else not too long ago how in book one, there's a character who is not necessarily a major character, but important to the story, and they're helping another character, get somewhere else, and end up sacrificing themselves, to help that other person out. And I had no intention of doing it. It just ended up being in the moment, like where it made the most sense. But like, I just realized, like, you know what? This person is going to have to sacrifice themselves, sacrifice their life to make things like continue on. And it's not that like I was necessarily tooting my own horn, but I was pretty proud of myself in the fact that I made this character in depth enough where like they drove the story themselves. They kind of like surprised me in that sense where it was kind of like this character was telling me how things have to be. And again, like I think if you detail your characters and layer them well enough, then it makes the story a lot easier to write, which is why it's so crucial.
Mm-hmm.
Like because again, that's what people relate to. Like whatever situation you put a good character into, like people will be able to appreciate that.
And I'm glad you brought that up for you, again, for you guys out there. Um, World building in itself and describing like the layout, the different locales, and them type of components within your book are not any less important. But it's a great point that you made of just if you just make some really good characters for people to resonate with, it's going to drive your story so much more further because a lot of times that's the driving force. It's not to say they don't care about like the city that they're in, for instance, that you're
Right.
describing, that is any less important. But in the end, it's more like what is this character saying to me?
Yeah.
Because the characters are really going to drive the story, the purpose of your story, your theme,
Right.
what kind of message that you're trying to bring out within your story. That's really going to be brought to the forefront through your
Yep.
characters and not all the other things that you got going on in the background.
And I think to that point, if you like flip it around and say like, okay, I have this great story, or somebody like has a really great premise for a story, but the characters are limited and basic, and like you said before, they all end up kind of sounding the same, then
Mm-hmm.
it's not worth reading. People aren't going to necessarily care how great the story was because the characters, just weren't intriguing. They weren't engaging enough.
Very good point. So I hope you guys again were aspiring to put your books together and inspiring to write, man. Really hone in more onto the characterization and really bringing some depth to your characters so
Yeah.
people can kind of like feel them as they're
Right.
going through the story. So in your book, The Ghost of Asher, which is part two, I feel like your central theme in that story is trust, as the remaining descendants must rely on different persons of interest to be their allies and
Right.
assist them in comprehending even more of their manifestations and themselves personally, right? So, do you feel it's vital for a story to have a central theme manifested, or should the story be more left up to interpretation?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I think it's a fine
Mm,
line, honestly. I think It's one of those things. I might have alluded to it before. Like, I think as writers, we already have things in us that are like begging to come out and come through in our stories anyway. And I think like to a certain extent, those themes are going to come out, like whether we want to or not. And so I don't know if it's something necessarily something we have to force. Like I think our reason for writing any particular story is because we want to get a point across. There's like certain ideas that we want to resonate with the audience, but I think beyond that, it's kind of fun to let the audience interpret things the way they want. Just because I think one of the really cool things is people will come to you and pick up on things or see things a certain way that you hadn't even considered, and that's like I think one of the most rewarding parts of writing and sharing your art is just seeing what other people get out of it. So in that
Mhm.
regard, I think it's you're better off limiting yourself in terms of trying to force themes into your book, or your story or art or whatever it is, and just otherwise let you as an individual kind of show through in that body of work, if you get what I'm saying, and let people take it how they want.
Mhm. I'm with it. I mean, that's one thing I got from again from my last two books I put out.
Yeah.
The short stories that I do cover all different genres,
Okay.
horror, science fiction, mythology, so forth and so on. And going to what you were saying, that's a real treat for me when people came to me and was just like, yo, when I got to the ending of your story, that really like you blew my mind with that because I did not realize you were going to go in that kind of direction. Uh, I thought, I think one of the things from people who read my books, one thing they mention a lot is that a lot of the endings are kind of like dark,
Okay.
and it's like they kind of wonder like, how come you don't really like write a story where it's kind of like the sun come through the clouds and the birds are chirping and everything is peachy and everything just kind of works itself out. And it's kind of like, well, I write in a way because it kind of mirrors real life, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
we don't always have a happy ending, you
Right.
know, or maybe this one character did, but this other one didn't. You know what I
Yep.
mean? So I kind of try to pull from reality to know that unfortunately we want the best outcome, but it just doesn't come out that way,
Yeah.
But I love it when someone says like, "Man, I'm going through the story, and then when I get to the end, I'm just like, yo, what is this guy doing to me, man? Like, I really thought it was going to go in this direction. It's just like you dropped a whole anvil on me. You know what I mean? Like, it's just mind blowing. And I guess for certain people, they would take. I guess they wouldn't take that so much as a compliment because they're just like, oh, well, I don't know why you didn't understand my story or why didn't you understand the ending, da 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 da. But to me, it's just like I love the fact of like what you were saying. That's how you interpret it as you read it.
Right.
So I love the fact that you were even able to or willing to open up your mind and expand your horizons and
Right.
come up with your own type of thing.
I think that's the ultimate compliment too. Is any type of artist is people um, getting so invested that they have like hopes about the way it's going to turn out or expectations, and the fact that they even feel disappointed in the first place means that like
Yeah.
they held stock in what you wrote, what you did, and were really invested in it. So like that's why I say you can't really get mad at that or be offended that
Mm.
people take it a certain way, because it just means that they're giving your art, your work, the time of day, and actually connecting with it.
I love it. I mean, it's the same way. I mean, even if I have certain people that come up to me and say like you know, not a big fan of the poetry, not a big fan of the short stories for whatever reason or whatever.
Yeah.
I still take that in. It's not a negative thing. The fact that they even
Right.
took the time out to read the book
Yeah.
in the first place,
Right.
that's a win for me. You know what I
Yep.
mean? I just hopefully the next time, the next book that I write, I could get them with that one. You know what I mean?
There you go.
So this next question is another one that's going to intrigue me, Khaled, that I would like to know. Uh, is there more enjoyment in writing for the hero or for the villain?
Oof.
Please
Um,
do explain.
sure. The heroes are fun, especially when you give them flaws and things like that. So, for instance, you know, Me, like, especially connecting with that idea of themes, one of the biggest things that I wanted to get across in the books was it's not black and white as far as like good and evil. There's definitely shades of gray for everybody, even the good guys. And I think in that regard, it's more fun to write the villains, just because in real life, like there's nobody that goes around saying like I'm the bad guy, and I want to do evil. And maybe there are, if there are, it's very few people. But I think for everybody, we're the hero of our own story, and we justify the decisions that we make, the actions that we do, how we treat people, whatever it is. There's always like in our head a reason for doing it, and we think that it's the right thing to do. And I think that's what makes it more fun to write the villain is because, you know, again, if you give them the proper character development, then they don't think they're the villain of the story. They're doing things because they think they're right and they think, either they're wronged or, the hero is the villain of the story. So I think in that regard, it's more fun to write the villain. Um, and speaking of which, towards the end of book 3, which I'm working on right now, we're going to start getting a lot more perspective of my main villain, the Red Harbinger, and actually seeing his mindset and his thought process and everything. And I was just telling somebody the other day, like I'm really looking forward to that, just because it's not something that I've done yet in the series, and it'll allow the audience to kind of see what exactly this person thinks and what's his reasoning for things, and you know does he actually want to see the world burn, or does he have a legitimate reason for doing the things that he's doing? And again, I think that's what makes it fun to write the villain, is because it's so easy to write them off as just a bad guy. But I think if you're doing it right, then they come across just as vulnerable, just as flawed, and even sometimes just as heroic as the hero sometimes.
I was hoping you say that. I was hoping you were going to say the villain. I think it's more fun writing for the villain than the hero.
Yeah,
Not to say you made a good point with the hero. You can add some dynamics to it. They're going to
right,
have flaws. They're not perfect. You know what I mean? They're going to
right,
make some wrong decisions along the way.
sure,
But the villain, I feel like you could just stretch that out when
yeah,
it comes to like their character development. Because, like you mentioned, they're the villain. They're considered the bad guy.
yeah,
But at some point in time, they were good.
yeah,
And maybe their intentions, as far as what they're doing, might actually be legitimate. It's
right,
just a little scared. It's just a little flawed in his
yeah,
reasoning. So now,
yep,
as a reader, you're thinking like, I'm, I'm, I'm really digging this villain, even though, you know, he's supposed to be the bad guy and I'm supposed to hate him. You
yep,
know, like when I'm glad that in the next book you're going to do more with the Red Harbinger, because that's what I was trying to get
yeah,
reading it, a little bit more from that character.
sure,
Because even if he's the villain, it's like he's one of my favorite characters.
okay,
And it's kind of like a messed up thing because it's like he's the villain,
yeah,
but it kind of reminds me of like when you see movies like for instance The Dark Knight. I'm a big fan of The Dark Knight. I'm a
me
big
too,
Batman buff. But I even if you're not in the comics, I think that's a great movie for people to
yeah,
appreciate.
yeah,
But even though the Joker is psychotic in nature, some of his line of reasoning as far as what he's doing,
right,
of course you're not going to resonate with the fact that he wants to harm people,
right,
but just his reasoning on just certain things as far as like how you interact with people and how
right.
people are in certain situations, it kind of does make you wonder like, wow, he might be making some sense here, you
Yeah,
know?
absolutely. They wrote him really well, just because I remember there was like a specific quote he makes about like, killing people, and he said, you kill a bunch of like soldiers and nobody bats an eye because that's what you expect to happen, right? But then
Mm-hmm.
you do that to a bunch of civilians, and all of a sudden everybody's up in arms. And like I think generally before that movie, a lot of people, like you said, just saw him as like this psychotic guy with no purpose, like no real motive. But that put a lot of things in perspective as far as like his ideology and his motivation and everything in that movie. And I think that's one of the reasons why it made it so good.
Yeah. And I also was thinking too of in the Avengers with the whole Thanos storyline.
Yeah,
Again, if you really pay attention to what he's saying and how they wrote that character, he actually made some kind of good points with that as well.
yep,
It's just his execution was wrong.
yeah,
But the fact that in a subtle way, it's kind of like he wanted to save the planet. His way
right,
of doing it is wrong,
yeah,
but the thought behind it as far as like just trying to save a world
Yep.
and not use up all his resources and so forth and so on.
Right.
It kind of just makes sense to like what we're going through now, presently. You know,
Yeah.
resources being used up, and it kind of just makes you wonder the big picture going down the road. Are we able to sustain this way of living? You know what I
Right.
mean? So I'm glad you brought that up with the villain. I'm glad you said that. I think there's a lot more wiggle room when it comes to that. I think with a hero, it's pretty much set. You can add some little
Right.
um, idiosyncrasies and some flaws here and there with the hero. But I think the villain is just it just gives you so
Yeah.
much range where you can work with. You know what I
Right.
mean?
That's
That
the thing. I think one of the tough parts of making the heroes vulnerable is once people connect with them, it's almost like they're going to support them no matter what, you know. And that happened, I think, in book one, where one of the characters gets so mad that he just makes it like rain fire, right? And you know, he get like he essentially doesn't care if like his whole town burns down. And I remember, just asking people about that, and the fact that like I think people were willing to forgive him or look past it or not see him as a bad person. That actually made me kind of mad because I'm like thinking, look at what he just did. How do you not, and I get it. He's the hero. You've been rooting for him like this whole time. But, if you flip it now and the villain did something like really good, like they wouldn't just accept him as good, he would still be bad. So, it's
mm,
just kind of funny the way it works, like with how readers connect with heroes as opposed to villains.
yeah, you know, to each their own. You know, and at the end of the day, it's like as long as they get to appreciate the story in itself,
Yeah,
you know what I mean? That's what you can ask for. You know, everybody has their preferences. At the end of the day, if a villain is a villain, that's how they're just going to accept them.
right.
But
Yep.
sometimes I kind of like think outside the box and
Yeah,
really just kind of really break down that villain, break down its character, and see
right.
like there's some humanity there. You know what I
Right.
mean? They just seem to be lost at the present
Yeah,
moment.
that's a great way of putting it.
So, Khaled, how about you provide the viewers a little insight when it comes to your writing process and maybe provide some techniques on how to write in a manner to which will allow the readers to resonate with the story?
Um, so I think planning is a really important part, which, like I said, I think that's why it's important to not get lost in the whole idea of like a word count and, how much you're actually typing every day. So for me, I basically walk around like with at least one notebook.
Me
Even at
too.
work during downtime. Like if something comes to mind. Same thing with my phone. I got the Notes app open and I type using um, Google Docs, and it's got this really new cool feature called like the tabs option, which now you can just jot down notes like without having to open something new. But that being said, I think it's important to just remember that it's not always about how many words you're writing towards the story. That planning is crucial. And you know like I said before, even though I might not outline to the like tiniest like detail, outlining is important just so you can kind of like see where you want things to go, how you want things to unfold, what you want to include. And even aside from the notebooks, I've got like three whiteboards in here, and one of them is just dedicated to the character arcs that I want to happen, throughout just book two. Where they're starting in book two, where I want them to end, what needs to happen like in between. But I can't really underscore just the planning process like uh, you know, just because it's more important than the actual writing. If you don't have that stuff in place, then the writing part isn't going to do much for your story. So um, I know people have various degrees of how much they outline, how much they plan ahead, and so, like it's the whole pantsers versus plotters, debate. Like some people just let it come out as it goes, and that's fine. But like you still have to have an idea of where you're going with it too. So I think that's definitely the most important thing is, um, just having like an idea in mind of where you want to go with this, and like you said before, how important it is to let other people read your work. Just get that feedback from time to time. Even now, like you with book three, I definitely still share out chapters to certain people here and there just to get what they think or see what questions they have, and see if like that works, like if it's got the right feel, if it like is frustrating, anything like that. And again, you have to definitely do it with people who will be honest with you, who you can trust, not to hurt your feelings. But you have to have a thick skin about that as well too. You're putting yourself out there, and you're doing it because you want people's honest opinions. So you have to be able to take that.
It's very refreshing that you to see somebody else actually write on paper because I'm the same way too. You know, I got a whole bunch of these as well
I
that I keep
Yeah.
around. I definitely keep a fresh notebook around with a pen.
Yep.
I don't know, with the age of technology, hey Zeus, just use your phone, use your tablet. I mean, come on now, just type that in real quick. But there's nothing like actually just writing it down. It's just a
Yeah.
different feel as I see
Oh,
the
absolutely.
words as I'm
Yeah.
writing. You know, I feel it a lot more.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm in my zone a lot more versus
Yep.
me just typing away.
Yeah.
I use the phone too, don't get me wrong. I use the tablet too,
Uh-huh.
but it's just something different about just getting a fresh notebook.
Right.
Like I always describe it to people all the time, like that's like one of the greatest gifts you can give me. It's a
Yeah.
fresh notebook. I open it
Yep.
up and I can already see the words filling up the pages already. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Versus anything else. And then the whiteboard too. I got a bunch of whiteboards all over the place too. That's why I like, with the kids or people that's coming into the studio, they'll look around and be like, man, you just got words everywhere, sentence everywhere. It looks like chicken scratch. You know what I mean? I'm like, I don't know how you're able to decipher any of this stuff around here, but it's my madness. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like there's a complexity, I guess, to the madness, but it works for me. You know what I
It makes
mean?
sense too, and that's what matters. Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's funny that you say that just because, like, with the writing stuff down, like physically, I mean, especially as a teacher, like in making students take notes all the time. First
Mhm.
instinct is let me type this, but like I looked into it and did the research on it, and like it's definitely even a scientific thing that if you're writing stuff by hand, like you said, it resonates with you more. Like you remember it better, you connect with it better, like it's in your head better. And I think that's one of the reasons why like I'm so comfortable doing it, just because I feel like I know the information better when I'm actually writing it out and letting it, process and just flow through that pencil, like all the time. And I feel like nothing just beats being able to write stuff in a notebook. It's just so comforting.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy how like certain people like comment toward me and they make it seem like it's such a old fashioned method. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, ew, you're writing it down. Like, why don't you just throw it on your phone real quick? You ain't got the notepad on your phone. Like I do. You know what I mean? Like I use the same thing that you use for Google, and I
Yeah.
also use Google Keep, which
Okay.
is like a form of their notepad as well.
Yeah.
Um, and it's great. It's great for jotting down some quick notes if I
Right.
know I'm going to forget it. You
Hmm.
know what I mean? But like you said, it's nothing like actually seeing it on paper and you can just kind of see your story or whatever it is you're writing. You can see it like come more to life
Yep.
within yourself on them pages in your notebook. So I'm glad to see somebody else is doing that. And I ain't the only one on the island over here doing that. So that's
A
great.
lot of
I
value
love
to
it.
it.
So, Khalid, we're at the point right now where it's like I want you to really, talk to our viewers out here. And what advice would you give for those who desire to put their aspirations into motion for success?
Step one, I'm a notorious slow starter, and I think there's a ton of advice
Yeah, me
out there
too.
where like a lot of people, tell you just take the first step. Um, and honestly, I think if that wasn't my biggest flaw, then these books probably would have been out like much earlier. But for instance, I first started processing this idea of this story probably maybe 2003 2004, somewhere around there, where I started like just coming up with this world and having scenes just go through my head and everything. But because I was afraid to take that first step, I didn't really actually write the first like scene until I think maybe 2009. And that I think in terms of writing, that's probably my only regret, is just not being confident enough to take that first step sooner. Just because so many people will tell you, you don't know what story you have until you actually start writing it. And so, it can't be bad or good if you never start it, and and
Mhm.
again, that's not even just for stories, that's for any type of art, any type of endeavor you're trying to, push yourself towards. Like, you don't know how it's going to turn out until you actually start it. And, I think that's the scariest step for a lot of us. But it's a big one to get past.
Yeah, I like how you broke that down because it's a shame that I've come across people at different events or just, through the confines of like my friends, associates, and whatnot, and they had
Yeah.
me bring somebody toward me that's aspiring to write. And sometimes they'll tell a story where it'd be like, yeah, I think about like 10, 15 years ago, I came up with this great idea for a book and I just never got around to it. And they'll take the time out for the next 5 or 10 minutes to explain their book. So clearly it's still resonating in your
Yeah.
head because
Yeah.
you memorize it to perfection.
Right.
The story, the characters, what's it about, so
Right.
forth and so on. And it's, I'm not saying, my response to them is like, I don't want to make them feel bad or anything like that. But
Right.
then as they're describing their book, I'm thinking in my head, it's like, it's a shame that you never just took that first
Yeah.
step. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like you got over your fear, you know what I mean? And kind of just starting putting that together because sometimes certain people that come to me and I'm listening to them, that sounds like a really good book. Like that has great potential. And
Right.
it's a shame, like now you got this mindset like, oh, well, I'm older now and too much time has passed. It's probably no point for me to do it. And I'm just like, there's no time restraint
Yeah.
when it comes to putting a book out. Like
Right.
you actually got a really great idea. And I'll tell them that.
Yeah.
I'm like, never have that thought that it's too late for you. Like, put it out.
Yep.
You owe it to yourself that you have an idea, you have a talent that you should explore. So, but their whole thing is just like, yeah, you're making a good point, but I don't know, man. I don't think in the end nobody's gonna like it. I'm just like, but how do you know? You
Yeah.
don't
Exactly.
know unless you try it out. I mean, I like it. I mean, I can't
Yeah.
speak for everybody, but what you
Right.
told me, I know if you published the book, I would get it and read it and
Right.
check it out and see if it's up to my liking. But you
Yeah.
just never know unless you just give it a good, honest try. You owe it
Right.
to yourself, right?
Yeah, I saw a really good quote. I think it might have been on Instagram like a couple weeks ago, where somebody posted, there's a good chance like my favorite book is just stuck in somebody's head because they never had the courage or the strength to actually write it out. And that resonated with me so much, and it made me so grateful that I pushed myself to do this, just because it's absolutely true. I mean, think of all the books that we love, stories that we love, music that we love. If those people decided, you know what, like this isn't going to be any good, why should I bother? Like, imagine like how much we would have missed out on, and how much we are missing out on because of people who are just too like afraid to put it out there. you know
Yeah, that's a good point. And at the end of the day, this is your passion.
yeah.
You love doing it. That's first and foremost why you write, or you
Right.
end up producing music, or you dive into some type of art form, is because you got
Yeah.
that deep passion for it,
Yep.
and then in turn, you're using that passion, that ambition, to motivate you to make application of what you learned. You know,
Right.
and then in turn, the cherry on top is, of course, you hope people will love your work. You
Right.
know, but at the end of the day, I also tell people too, like, nobody can rob you of your accomplishment.
Right.
You know, you could say with your chest out, like, you're a published author. Like, my
Yeah.
work is out there for people to check out
Right.
and purchase and enjoy. So, in that regard, you should get some type of satisfaction from that as well.
Yeah, and going back to your original question, that started all this. I mean, I think that's an important factor too. Is probably something that goes along with like why people are hesitant or afraid to actually pursue, writing a whole book. You think like I need to appeal to the whole world, to make this successful. And I think that's also kind of faulty because, you have to write your story, and who likes it is going to like it. And, some people won't, and you can't worry about that. You have to write, what it is that you want to get out, and just let the rest, unfold the way it's going to.
And let it speak for itself. You know
Yep.
what I mean? So, very good point. I'm glad you brought that up. So, for you guys out there, again, for you're aspiring to explore that aspect of your life and explore your writing, um, the first step is always hard,
Yeah.
but over time, get over your fear and just put yourself out there. You know
Right.
what I
And
mean? At the end of the day, if you love it so much, it will manifest itself over time. You will
right.
get better at it if you continue to practice. You know, I love the point that you made, Khaled, about just keep writing. You know, that's
Yeah.
a big thing with me. Even if my thoughts are not very cohesive and I'm just kind of more or less just jotting down notes, some
Right.
phrases, some words here and there, I'll make sense of it eventually. But at
Sooner or
least
later.
I'm
Yeah.
in that process, right? Of just
Yep.
constantly writing. So I don't my skill set doesn't become dormant.
Right.
Where it's like it makes it that harder for me to get back into it. Right. So Khaled, I think we at the point right now, we're at the tail end of this awesome, outstanding interview. So for the viewers, to provide for the viewers out there, what is new on the horizon for you?
Okay. Well, I mentioned it probably a couple times that book three is, underway. I've
Yay! Can't wait.
I've been making it a point to be more visible on Instagram and also, TikTok too, just to, you know, uh, just talk about my process and the progress that I'm making. So book three is due out like towards the fall of this year. So hopefully, I just managed to keep pace with that. Um, the other thing, is kind of a side piece like that I work on away from fantasy is so my background is Guyanese, and I grew up in a predominantly white suburb, and obviously, that was in like the '90s, and definitely some struggles like with like identity and navigating those teenage years through that type of like environment. So
Right.
like the piece of work that I'm working on the side is kind of like a semi-fictional memoir, in the backdrop of like 1990s Woodbridge, New Jersey, as like a Guyanese teenager just trying to figure things out, figure out who I am, and find my place in the world. And it's fun to switch to sometimes, just because with fantasy everything is world building and super creative, whereas like with this other thing it's very different, where the world is technically there already. I have to remember sometimes like what existed back then as opposed to now, but it's kind of a nice switch sometimes to make, just because I don't have to think as much about the actual world. It's more about like the character and the interactions with other people. So that's whenever I need a break from working on like the fantasy series and my mind's not there, then that's how I keep myself productive, by still writing something.
Awesome, awesome. I can resonate with that because for me to take a break from writing, because we all get writer's block, and
Yeah,
then we're just like getting all flustered with that. Like, man, how do I go from here? I'm still stuck with this first sentence. I ain't even finished a paragraph yet. So I tend to like gravitate toward music. If it wasn't writing, it's music. I'm a big music person. So just
nice.
me, just being in the studio, just producing some things, it definitely gives some clarity. I know they're two different mediums, writing and producing music, but still it's that form of creating.
Right.
And
It's
then it
important.
just kind of starts jogging some things in my head while I'm in here just playing around, just trying to put some music together.
And it's funny how it all connects. I mean, I think as long as you're trying to be creative in some aspect, like sometimes it'll give you motivation for going back to the other thing that you were
Mm-hmm.
taking a break from, and give you new ideas, or just like a fresh outlook. And
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to point out, it's kind of related to what we were talking about before, but um, I think you know, no matter what we're doing, especially with like art, this community is so great, where I think people are so supportive of each other, like no matter what you're putting out, or, whether like you're having struggles with that writer's block, or, as long as like, you're trying to do something, and even if you're new to it, there'll always be people to help out and to give you advice, and, um, just to support you. It's funny how like the writing and art industry works, where it's not like there's room for everybody. It's not one of those things where we have to compete with each other. It's
Mm-hmm.
everybody's allowed to just support each other because there's enough to go around.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I do have a nice network of people of different authors that I can kind of like, go to,
Yeah,
just be like, you're not looking for them to write it for you,
right.
but it's just great to just talk with them and be like, hey, I'm
Yeah,
spitballing this idea. What do you think?
yeah,
Like, if you were in my shoes, how would you
yep,
go about developing this concept? And
right.
it's just nice to, like, I love being around like-minded people,
Yeah,
who's being creative. They're working toward their goal. They're working toward bringing their vision to life. It's very
right.
invigorating, and it's
Yeah,
also a great learning experience as well,
right.
because I'm not about the ego either. I'm
Yeah,
very aware that I could read somebody else's work and they're clearly light years ahead of me when it comes to their writing ability or whatever it is that I'm working on.
right.
But it's never an ego thing. It's, to me personally, it's like a learning. Like, I want to
Yeah,
learn from you, whether it is I'm actually reading your book or if I have the opportunity to actually talk to you,
right.
I'm going to flood you with a bunch of different questions to just kind of get your insight on what you do. Not to mimic or copy what you do, but just
Right.
to help me get that motivation within me.
And yeah, and that's the best part of doing these types of things and doing the author events, the book shows, and everything is like you'll always be able to interact with other people in the field. And I mean, I think like 99% of the time you'll walk away with like having learned something new or gained something or just motivated, to do something else like with your own work. And it's the best feeling.
Well, Patty, you're the man because I know I've seen a lot on IG, and I seen it at this recent book event. I mean, you just got flooded of people coming to the table getting your books. You're definitely doing your thing. Again, I'm a big fan of your work. I can't wait for part 3 to come out. Not just for me to read it, but hopefully get you back on the show so we can
Yeah,
have
sounds
another discussion about it. Um, just real quickly for the viewers out there, where can they go get your books?
so. It's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, even I think Walmart carries it online. You can also
Well,
go to my website, khaliduddin.com. There's a link to them there as well. Or just see me at the next event too.
awesome. Do you have any events coming up?
Um, I think in April is the Burlington Library Book Festival, which is I forgot the name of the town that it's in, but it's at one of their library branches. That's honestly a real fun one. I didn't realize like a couple years ago it was their first time doing it, and it was so well run that I didn't like know that that was their first time doing it. But last year I met this really cool, excuse me, comic book writer named T. Franklin, and we definitely connected really well to the point where we are going to try and just like make some things happen in the coming future as well. I don't want to give up too much just yet, just because we got to talk about everything first. But
Right, right,
you
right.
know, some good ideas in the mix. But yeah, so April is the first one for this year. Um, a lot of I think the book festivals tend to be in the fall, so
Mhm.
after April, I don't know if I have anything for like a little bit, but until like September. But we'll see. We'll
Okay.
see what else.
Well, it sounds good. For you guys out there, don't hesitate. As soon as you watch this video, do yourself a favor and get these books.
There it
Stop
is.
playing around. Support local authors. You're not going to be disappointed. These were great reads. Um, I'm probably going to plan on rereading these in the short future, in the near future, because they're just that outstanding. Trust me, you're not
Thank
going to be disappointed. The world building, the character development is insane. Callie, I wish all the success and blessings to you. Again, we can't wait for the third one to come out. And thank you so much for being on the show today and
Oh,
just
thank
having
you
this
for
great
having me.
discussion.
Yeah, I appreciate it. No, the pleasure's all mine. I mean, it's just so much fun to talk to, like you said, like-minded people, and just have an opportunity to talk about my craft. So I'm very appreciative, of you taking the time out to do this with me as well. And to everybody out there, thank you for listening. Feel free to reach out. I always love talking about the craft, my stories, whatever it is. So I'm very accessible and always willing to just chat it up.
Awesome. So you heard it from the man himself. Do yourself a favor, grab the book series. It's awesome. Callie, again, all the blessings to you. Thank you for being on the show. You guys know who it is. It's Zeus Cruz. of Olympian Multimedia, offering you another segment of A Word with the World. And the only thing left to say is we'll check you later. Appreciate you tuning in.